Welcome to Books with Noah, a podcast where I talk with my friends about their favorite books. Today joining us is Michael. Michael is an engineer, tinkerer, father, and a voracious reader. In non-pandemic times, he sings archaic music with a choir in Palo Alto. Welcome to Books with Noah, Michael.
Good to be here.
Awesome. So today we are discussing Solzhenitsyn's pivotal work, the Gulag Archipelago. And so why don't you tell us what this work is and who Solzhenitsyn is?
So Alexander Solzhenitsyn was a army officer in the Red Army, and he wrote some letters to a friend gently critiquing the administration, and for that was sent to the Gulag, which of course is the vast apparatus of prison camps are operated by the Stalinist government. It grew out of some of the prisons that Tsar Nicholas had, but the communists much expanded and extended that, and then having filled up the various prisons and things around Moscow, they extended in this archipelago, like an island chain that extended out eastward all the way into Siberia. And so if you said something that somebody didn't like, there'd be a knock on the door in the middle of the night, and you'd go in a van to a local holding cell and eventually hauled before a judge who would write your name on a conviction that was already typed out, and you'd be transported from prison to prison. If you had a relative who happened to be there, then you'd be sent to a next one to keep everybody isolated. And eventually they'd put you on a train and shuttle you across the frozen Arctic and drop you off at a camp. Sometimes the camp wouldn't even be built yet. And says, here's some tools, go out into the woods. First, you got to build the prison, the guards' barracks, and then you can build some shelter for yourself. And it's 60 below in the frozen Siberian Arctic. So there's this long, vast chain of these things, and they were nominally work camps. And they extended until the end of Stalin's reign, and then they sort of fizzled out after that.
So my understanding is, just to go back a second, Solzhenitsyn, these are mostly first-person accounts of his time there that he wrote afterwards. Is that right?
Correct. So Solzhenitsyn spent I think he did 2 terms, maybe, so close to 20 years in these prison camps. He got out. The reason he was able to survive is he put down, I think he had to fill out a survey about what his skills were, and he wrote nuclear physics and something like that. And right. So he ended up attached to a rather cozy division of political prisoner scientists who were building bombs or something like that. So he had some preferential treatment, but before that he just talked to everybody who was coming through the camps and asked, how things were. And after he got out, and after his during his exile, he was able to write it down. And so this, in English, it occupies 3 gargantuan volumes. The audible version, which I listened to, is 3 25-hour parts.
Yeah.
So it's 76 hours total
right.
of it's a narrative structure. It starts with the knock in the night and the torture and the courts, and it goes through some toward the end, kind of toward a redemptive vision of escape attempts and freedom and exile, and it starts pretty dark, but leaves you with a little bit of hope toward the end.
Yeah. So, I mean, to be honest, I only read volume 1 of 3, which you said is the most brutal, as it focuses on, the torture techniques to get people to confess.
Don't leave a mark.
Right. Yeah, and like you said, the the quotas, for the Stalin regime applied to everything, not just production of goods at factories, but also, you were expected to have, X number of prisoners appear and go to, whichever camp. And so yeah, like you said, the story of the conviction forms being pre-filled, just waiting for the next poor guy to walk through the door so they could write his name at the top. And that's so tragic.
And it wasn't hard to find transgressions. There's this Article 58 of the Soviet legal code, which was basically any sort of subversive activity against the government, and it could be as innocuous as oh, you've got your picture of Stalin that you neatly clipped out of the newspaper, and like, oh, I'm such a good model citizen. You put it on your wall, and then you tack up another, your schedule or something on your bulletin board, and you accidentally stick the pin through Stalin's head. Like that'll get you a tenner in the Gulag. There's another great story about a businessman who ran a nice factory, and he was at this big reception or speech of Stalin, and Stalin finishes speaking, and there's 5 minutes of applause, and everybody's hands are hurting, and goes into 10 minutes of applause, and people are fainting, having to be carried out on stretchers, and finally one of the guys on stage stops clapping and sits down, and then everybody else stops clapping and sits down. They were waiting for that first guy to stop, and of course the next day, that the guy who was the first one to stop clapping, he was sent to the Gulag. So it's it's a tall poppy syndrome, or the nail that sticks up gets hammered down. But
right, somebody has to, and then boom, they're gone. Why don't you tell us about the the water company and the guy who was running that?
So Article 58 applied to any sort of subversive activity. So it could be wrecking or sabotage. But so there's this guy old bachelor engineer who'd been running the Moscow Water Company, had some of the cleanest water of any European capital, and he'd been running it for decades. And there was a guy who was hired on to do as just a low-level worker in the water company, who was fired for being a terrible worker, and of course that guy went to the local Politburo and got himself appointed as the Politburo representative of the water company, and they placed him on the board. So he now was the boss of this guy who'd fired him, and the boss kept going, and oh, we need a new pump or a new filter unit or something, and the Politburo, through this miscreant snitch, like, why are you spending all this money? You don't need a new pump. And so he was accused of, this engineer who was accused of wasting money, and so when the old pump did break down, now the guy who didn't replace the pump because they wouldn't leave him the money, now he's a saboteur and a wrecker, and so he's hauled off. So it's there is no way. The only way to win is not to play, and that wasn't an option.
Right. Yeah, and he goes into excruciating detail about item after item of that guy's job, and how, like you said, he would give suggestion A and he would get in trouble for that. Give suggestion B, which is the opposite of suggestion A, and he would get thrown in jail for either outcome regardless. And it's impressive. So and then there was talk about digging the troughs and the laborers. I mean,
so
there's more.
Stalin wanted a canal between the White Sea and the Baltic. There's a few other bodies of water in and along there, but 141 miles long, and he needed it by, I forget what the deadline was, his birthday or something. It was like 18 months away, and so they dug it in the Arctic winter. I don't think it's actually above the Arctic Circle, but it's pretty cold, and these guys are having to dig a canal by hand, and so they were just the Soviet apparatus was just feeding prisoners into this.
Like, you mean by hand, literally with hands, right? Not with shovels.
Oh yeah, so shovels are too expensive.
Yeah.
Wheelbarrows are too expensive. So these guys are fashioning shovels out of just scrap lumber they can find. They're building wheelbarrows and skids out of, maybe they're lucky enough to find a wheel, but they've got to build the wheelbarrow, because how else are you going to move 141 miles of dirt? And it's not all one level. You've got to build locks to move the ships up and down. So the locks are made out of lumber, but concrete's too expensive. So loads of concrete and sand and mud that turns into ice. So that works well enough until it thaws, but by that time you've already gotten signed off. So but the estimates are 25,000 people died building this canal. Mostly from exposure and from being crushed, but they were expendable.
Yeah, it's unbelievably tragic. And at that point, the number of deaths is just a statistic, like those quotes. I mean, it's just so many people dying all over the place in the book. It's crazy. Makes you wonder, what the Soviet Russia, population would look like if the state hadn't actively put so many people in harm. Have to take a deep breath.
That raises an interesting point. Is some genocides and some atrocities of the 20th century are talked about, and others are not completely. So most people in the West don't really know. I mean, they've heard of the Gulag, but it's kind of a joke, and they don't understand the magnitude of the atrocity.
Right.
And partly this is because the Soviets were our nominal allies. After Hitler went back on his Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, but they sort of were our allies after that, and so we can't speak against Stalin because he's our ally. And we've got American financial interests and industrial experts, kind of playing both sides of the fence and feeding. So supporting the Soviet industrial effort, and so there's a lot of vested interests in the U.S. and elsewhere in the West who are not so keen on playing up the brutality of the Stalin regime.
Right. Yeah. When I was listening to this, I was thinking, my God, the 20th century was an awful time for so many people. And I think we're really steeped right now in this time where everybody's complaining that, I don't know, whether it's, baby boomers wrecking the financial sector or whatever, everyone's complaining about how awful it is now. But this, I think, really highlighted that, things have been a whole lot worse for a whole lot of people. And it wasn't, I don't know. And since it was written after the fact, I kind of had this feeling that it wasn't like it was, what's the word, pessimistic or hopeless, right? Because obviously the system is not around today. Things are better. I mean, they're not perfect, and will never be perfect, but it kind of gave me a sense of optimism. I was curious what your perception or how you felt, reading about all these tragic events.
Like I said earlier, he crescendos out of the depths and up into the light, really toward the end. There's some good escape stories, of which of course he only knows about the escapees who were recaught and ended up back in the camp to tell their story. Leaving that aside, there's some good stories of escapes and prisoner risings that I urge you to read. I think they're in the second, maybe in the third book. And toward the end, he's a free man. He writes in his head like epic poem that he memorized line by line by having some of the religious prisoners make him a prayer bead rope, and he counts the groups of 10, and if he forgets a stanza, he goes back until he remembers it. And so he's able to commit large amounts of poetry to memory, which he writes down later. I don't think it's completely translated into English yet, unfortunately. And then he gets out, and like I said, he ended up in some physics lab, and then he was exiled. Nobody was allowed to go back to their normal life before. Nobody was allowed to go back to their home. He didn't see his wife again until much later. His children grew up without him, thinking he was dead, and he takes another wife actually in exile. But they dump you out out in Kazakhstan or wherever, somewhere very far from where you came from, with hardly any money, poor clothing, and they say like, "Hey, figure it out, find a trade, figure out a house." And the locals don't really want to deal with these released prisoners. But he was able to work through that. He was able to write down the Gulag Archipelago in secret in a typewriter stashed out in the woods. I think there's a cabin in the woods where he spent a lot of time writing it in several long stretches, and then had copies made. There's the samizdat, which is the Russian word for kind of like illegal underground copy, like bootleg copies. And these were circulated, and some of them snuck out. His first book, if you want just a taste, is One Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich, which is it's a short, maybe 100-page novel about one day in the life of this guy in the Gulag, and gets up and it's freezing, and gets his boots from the fire, and somebody got a care package, but it goes through, and so that was able to be published in Russia actually, and then the government realized they made a mistake, and they stopped that, but it had already gotten out. It had been translated in the West, and that's where he really made his name, and eventually his reputation grew internationally and within the Soviet Union. And by the time the officials kind of figured out what was happening, he was too famous for them to kill, so they just kicked him out of the country. So that began
here, right?
That began his 20 years exile in the West, in the United States, and traveling around. And he always wanted to make it back to Russia, which he wasn't really able to do until fall of the wall. And in the West, they thought he was a bit of a hero. This is great. There's this guy, he spoke out against our enemies. It's the Cold War, so Soviets are bad, and so he's anti-USSR. That means he must be pro-democracy. That means he must be pro-America. This is a great guy. And so Harvard,
and he gives the Harvard address,
give his commencement address in 1978, and he goes up to wide applause. He's like frumpy bearded guy in a big suit with he's speaking through an interpreter, and they think he's going to be great. He's going to be a pro-America. And then he says, what the West lacks is courage. Especially your leaders in the West, they don't lead because they don't have courage, and there's no soul in the West because you don't have enough suffering. What the West lacks is suffering. And there's like audible hissing from the people in the audience, it's really worth that A Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich and the Harvard commencement address. If you don't have time, 76 hours for Gulag, I start with those other two works.
Right.
And the big thing about Solzhenitsyn is, and kind of like the commencement address is it's easy to vilify the other. Is Soviet Union bad, Khmer Rouge bad, Pol Pot bad, Nazis bad. But one of the most famous quotes from the book is the line between good and evil runs through the center of every human heart. We're struggling with ourselves. Depending on the circumstance, like we could be that guy who's pushing the button for the Soviets, or
right.
And we all have those little bits of cruelty, I think, that we struggle with in our own lives. Just making the right decision, trying to be, good human beings. And it's you got to start with number one, just that we all have that little, demon who's if left unchecked and if channeled, turns into a genocidal superstate. It's just,
yeah,
that's the story of the 20th century.
That's scary. Speaking of that, Jordan Peterson has claimed that the Gulag Archipelago is the most important book of the 20th century, and I suspect it's because Solzhenitsyn manages to kind of show the human essence in a different and kind of scary way. Shows you the good, the bad, and um, it. I think that's probably why it's a must read for most people, especially people like us who are in the 21st century who didn't live through, in Soviet Russia. And, there's a lot of, I think, wisdom to be gained.
Absolutely. There's also the danger of kind of technocratic solutions is, if we just have the right experts in charge, if we just have the right bureaucracy, if you just have the right laws, then we could fix things. And no, it starts with people. It's and vast governments, if steered right, can do some good things, but it's a force too powerful to rein in. And somebody like Stalin gets a hold of the reins, and no good can come of it. So there's this real tendency in the West, like, oh, well, we should just have the right laws against people like that, or people like that should be re-educated, or people like that just should know better.
Right, or just make it illegal, whatever it is. Yeah. It'll go away if we do that.
Right. So it's a real warning against that tendency.
Yeah, fantastic. Do you have anything else you'd like to add?
That's really it. It's other than just go read about this man and some of the things he's written.
Yeah, I completely agree. Well, thank you so much, Michael. Thank you for being part of Books with Noah.
Thank you, Noah.
Thanks for listening to Books with Noah. Please visit our website, bookswithnoah.com. You can also find us on YouTube by searching Books with Noah.